all CEOs, me included, we don't actually know what we're doing.
They're all sharks, so all you got to do, though, is know shark behavior.
I don't think we've ever talked about this before.
We can capture all of the wallet share.
First place you start is with the product.
That's just the first note.
This is the Capital Stack. Hey everybody, this is David Paul, the host of the Capital Stack podcast, where I talk to founders, operators, and investors about everything value creation in startups. This morning, I am talking to Angela Lai of Betteromics, who is the founder and CEO. She is a multi-decade executive within Silicon Valley, technologist, where but incredibly prolific. Spent a numerous amount of years in the upper technical leadership at Google, followed by being the chief technical officer of a little company called Grail, which has raised hundreds of millions of dollars for early cancer detection, was bought by Illumina. I think they're trying to divest it now, which is whatever that means. And now you have your own startup in the life sciences business. Angela, how are you doing?
Great. Thank you, David, for inviting me. Really appreciate, being on your show and see how it goes.
What do you want for Christmas this year?
I need a personal retreat where I don't talk to anybody for a couple of days and I do not look at my phone. And I need to be an introvert for a few days.
I try to do that quarterly. My wife ruins it.
Don't tell her that. Don't say that. Don't say that. That's bad. You're on record, David. You can't say things like that.
I can say, but she doesn't listen to any. I don't even think she knows what I do for a living.
Someday when your kid grow up and say, "Mom, did you know?"
Yeah, she
just said this about you.
Yeah, she doesn't give a shit. Like she has no idea. I walk in, I come home, and that's it. No excuses. Play like a champion. Angela, what was the transition between Grail? I just real lightly, just give me a little career jumping between Google to Grail to Betteromics.
Sure. I was at Google for 12 years. For my time at Google, I've worked for two people. The first one is Jeff Huber, who is the chairman, founding CEO of Grail, and also senior VP at Google. The second person is Amit Singhal, who is the king of search, as people called him. But Jeff Huber and Amit, on January 26th of 2016, both left Google on the same day. And it was a clear sign that it was time for me to go. And so Jeff recruited me to go be one of the founding team members of Grail. And it was not a difficult decision to make when, the people that you admired that sponsored you at a company, thought that it was time to go. So, but of course, I learned a lot, and it was a big deal to have gone through that journey for that decade at Google when it was growing at exponential rate. But when Jeff called, in all seriousness, it was also a super noble mission to find a way to help people get earlier detection of cancer, and it was very emotional and difficult to resist. And so it was the beginning of this movement, I think, that is still, happening today is, biological science and, chemistry is merging and is entering this big data phase and AI development in R&D and drug, and also day-to-day running biotech companies. And so the transition was both serendipitous and also, I think, is the times that Grail started, also with a little bit of a flair, like tech companies doing things that a lot of people said cannot be done. And so that attracts crazy people like me to work on it. And for the few years, it was just like Google, a tremendous journey, because you were in this company where there are a lot of naysayers, And as a technologist, also my eyes were wide open. The privilege of working with, the best and brightest of clinicians and scientists to go after something that's as big as it is now, that's in the news all the time for not necessarily all the right reasons, but nonetheless, it was quite a journey. And I only had high school biology when I went to Grail. And so it was fascinating to see the development that was going so fast. And every day I see this biotech space, I feel like it is the internet being played out in a different form a couple decades later. So I really fell in love with the space, loved the people, loved the speed of development, and also love the fact that there's so many unknowns in this space that is super exciting to be part of it. And after Grail, I still feel that the best way for me to add value is as a software engineer. I'm not a scientist, I'm not a clinician, but I watched how scientists and clinicians did not have the best tools afforded to them to go through this big data journey. And so the learnings that I have from Grail, I started this company that is a software enterprise company for life science. And Betteromics is in providing better software for scientists and clinicians trying to make a difference in this space, in this new world of big data in health science and biology.
So just to touch on that, the jump to Google, which, obviously you were in a huge inflection point, they were growing like crazy, to Grail, which you were there in 2016, you were there when it started.
Yeah.
Now, did they have a thesis, or were they just saying like, this is the problem set, we're going to go solve this? Was there any particular research that they were betting the farm on?
Yeah, so it was fascinating in the space of, so Grail was a spin out from Illumina, and this like full circle going around 15 times with Illumina. And Illumina had this technology from the NIPT world, which is a non-invasive prenatal test, which is a non-invasive way of testing the blood of women in order to find out information about the fetus. Mm-hmm. And if you think about it, the strange, almost slightly weird thing is that the baby is sort of like a tumor in a woman's body, because there's all this foreign DNA that's floating in the woman's womb. And Illumina has a company called Veronata that had these samples from women, and the clinician scientist Meredith Miller was conducting this research that belongs to Illumina, where these women have these readings that were off the charts. And it was not DNA that belonged to the fetus, but unfortunately, cancer that was undetected in these women. And so that was the beginning of that thesis, that there is a way out of these other research in women's health, to a different way to go look at and find these signals in people's blood that belongs to a tumor, and that it would potentially detect tumors before they were detectable by other screening means that we have. And so that was the thesis that was backed by these serendipitous findings in a different test. And since then, because that's the beginning of the signal, then it goes into the science realm of, is this the best signal? Are other signals that would be similar and cheaper to find? And so Grail started with that research backing and explored sort of nearby areas, so different types of signals, and did a bunch of experiments and found the best one that you have to balance between the sensitivity of the signal and the cost of acquiring that signal, and that became the first test that was commercialized, and that took about 3 years of development.
That's amazing. And now I hear they're trying to get insurance to be reimburse it, which I think is going to be amazing.
Yeah, as it turns out, that's the hard part.
Yeah.
Science is already really hard, and it stands on the shoulders of all the previous research, right? So it's not like the one company that discovered everything. It has, this trail of research that has been coming through. And commercialization is a totally different realm of trying to get payers to pay for it, especially in America. That's also an interesting system that I came to learn at Grail, where consumers don't actually pay for any of this, and even if you want to pay, the prices are set based on these bigger systems that are outside of what consumers do. But that's a whole different realm. That's like completely
whole different realm. Not your monkey, not your circus anymore. You had enough to chew.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a software engineer by training, and talking science is already a little bit outside of my comfort zone. And but as a software engineer, as we try to learn every domain and use our skills to help solve problems, automate issues in other domains. And ever since Grail, it's very difficult to find another more exciting world where there's so much unknown. The body is so strange. Biology is so undiscovered. And so it's fascinating to see. And having been at Grail, just reading day-to-day news during the pandemic, I just can't imagine how I would have understood these numbers so differently if I hadn't been at Grail. I mean, all the vaccine development that was so fast in those few years, so different. Statistics is already hard, as you know, even for day-to-day, just understanding statistics is so hard. And a pandemic's all about, epidemiology and statistics. And having the background that Grail just made those few years, there's yet another layer of what's interesting to decipher in the pandemic years.
And so through Grail, you realized that there's a bunch of disparate systems of record when it comes to going through these clinical trials for these life science companies. Data is fragmented. It's non-uniformed. There's probably the custody, the compliance around the custody of this data is something that has to be desired, not to mention just business model probably challenges within funding and stages and how does a company exist. So when I look at Betteromics, and correct me if I'm wrong, it kind of looks like a regulated, secure data lake / warehouse for data, for healthcare science data, in which you basically serve as the system of record, and then you can be interoperable with all the stages along the clinical discovery journey. Is that my
You're a genius, David?
Dude, I know. No one believes me.
How can they not?
I know. I feel like I'm taking crazy pills. No one thinks I'm a genius.
Oh, I do.
Okay, good. Yeah. So that's
the space is because of the regulation, and I actually experienced something super similar in finance world. And this would be interesting especially for some of the audience and that are interested in investing. There's a lot of parallels between life science and fintech. Fintech went through such a revolution, right, in the last 10, 15 years. And fintech was very similar. People are very careful with building their IT systems because it's regulated. Life science is like 2 orders of magnitude more so in the way that people are willing to tolerate risk and how systems are built, because this risk averseness is so important, and this exacting, of how you deal with your data, how you store it, how you govern it, like you said, the data governance of it and custody of it, the records of it being accretive. You can never delete anything. In life sciences, because it's life and death, is ever more important. And so what was difficult to operate in fintech, there is just 2 orders of magnitude more complicated in life science, and it's all the practices of how it was before the digital revolution of fintech in the last 10, 15 years. is exactly the same in life science today. And it would take longer than fintech to adopt it. And there will be more exacting and more sort of like carefulness in how to do this. And I say that also because at Google, I was responsible for rewriting the payments platform when the company was going from, the $40 billion business to $100 billion business. Mm-hmm. And it was that risk averseness that made, despite all the advances that Google was in, its finance system was pretty archaic. There are a lot of manual steps. And automating it is very difficult because the operators that are so smart and so careful with so many regulations wants to be careful about this. And so that transformation is very difficult. But you figure it out, and there's value to it, and value will be generated from it. In life science, I think it's the same thing. This data silo, the data is super important. And because every sample matters, the sample size is small. It's not like buying toothbrushes. Everybody buys two toothbrushes a day. It's the same toothbrush. People are very different. Biology is very different. Samples are very scarce. And so every piece of data matters. And so you have to be super careful about it. And the data government is ever more important because of privacy, because of security, because you also don't want to overfit. There are all kinds of technical reasons as well as human reasons for this data to be so exacting in these silos. And so, but just like every other industry, having transparency and linking the data together so you can analyze it like a through train is important and will generate value. But making that digital transformation is work. And, hopefully we're in the middle of that to help generate value for, people that have this data that needs to figure out how to create new products from it.
So when you look at the market, what does it look like to you on this side? Are there just a couple big players with this real large long tail of people innovating and then the big players buy them? How do you think about positioning your software for that?
Yeah, pharma is super strange, right? In healthcare, it's like there are these big players that is this barrier for sort of adopting new things. And once again, I hearken to how fintech made that transformation, and fintech's the same. In every corner, there are a couple of really big players that will adopt things in corners, and then over time, it will get adopted by the industry. And I think that, they're and the macro climate plays a lot into it. In the last 2 years, it hasn't been, the world hasn't been very kind to biotech. And so it's been difficult for people to think about how to make these transformations when capital is scarce. But I think it's also an opportunity for people when they wake up, hopefully people are waking up into 2024, that there is an opportunity to do things more efficiently and adopt new systems to do it, because the economics has to change, right? Everybody talks about how R&D in pharma has to continue to shrink in how much, they spend, because only, 5% or less of the drugs make it to the market. And it's important to figure out how to make it more efficient and make it more predictable, anything that can reduce risk. Just like every industry, having transparency in data is one of the best ways to reduce risk. And so, I think that there is either going to be the mid-sized companies that figure out how to adopt it in corners, and then it gets acquired into the bigger pharmas, or it is a runaway success, which in pharma there hasn't been a lot. Where
there's not a lot of stories for that.
Yeah. Somebody can show what that looks like. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know which way this will win. And as a platform, though, as a company, the reason that I want to be a platform, it's, you don't really care who is doing the gold digging. You want to be building the picks and shovels. And so I remember in 98, I talked to Diane Green about utility computing. But AWS didn't really take off as a thing. Diane Green of VMware, and AWS people didn't really know what utility computing is until well into the 2000s and 2010. And so I see infrastructure for helping get transparency into data and breaking down these silos as something that is a must happen kind of thing in the next decade or two. And for me, it is finding those champions that seize the opportunity and want to be first in market, and partnering with those sort of like visionary leaders at the current stage to make this, be a reality. And I would like to say that this is technically the most difficult thing to do. It actually isn't. It is the same playbook that has happened in other industry that just absolutely needs to happen in life science.
So has there just been a technological change that's enabled this to be solved currently? Is it that you, as a founder, have the gumption to tackle it? What's changed in the timing perspective?
So one of the things that I think, technology has gotten a lot better. And one of the characteristics of life science is that the data is changing in its definition. So if you think about edtech, fintech, a transaction is a transaction. There's time with it and there's the size of it. Micropayments make for a much bigger scale of these transactions. And so generally large-scale read and write has helped with how that gets developed. Recently, even in tech, there's a lot of innovation in natural language, in understanding not just the text and not just the transactions, but the meaning of things. And that's, I was privileged to work at Google and build this thing called Knowledge Graph, which Google was one of the few companies that can afford to do it because it's deep technology that takes a lot of resources. But now every university student, graduate student in computer science understands and can build a knowledge graph. And that gives a flexibility for understanding of data that is very much needed in life science. In life science, it is not simple data. These are reasoned, deep tech data, deep science data that has very complicated data models. And they cannot easily be done with relational databases. And it's also evolving because we don't yet know how biology works. And that's a hallmark of data that requires a knowledge graph, is that you have to have flexible ontology. And so we are tackling it with a knowledge graph-based system so that our customers can add new entities, new understanding of the data without having to a priori decide what the schema is. It's sort of like if you don't quite know what the map of the world is and you are building it, you need a very flexible system to know how the roads would go. And, and all those entities, you need a place where you can dump all that data in, but still be able to search it, which is how a lot of these new language systems work. And I think that we have that technology now much more popular than it was 10 years ago. And it makes for a much more flexible system that scientists that are doing discovery and therefore requires this flexibility can use the system and accretively build the knowledge into the system and make this data be usable and understandable for discovery.
So the 5% of drugs, the 95% that don't make it to market, would you say that that's because of execution runway versus it just didn't work? The thesis, the science wasn't there.
I'm sure it's both, right? Yeah. I mean, there are ones where the data is not there, where you can't quite tell whether it didn't make it because it didn't have the data or it really is not the right thesis. You just don't know.
You can't tell.
And there are a lot of things that are on the shelf, even though it doesn't work for this particular manifestation of disease. I mean, there are things molecules that are sometimes on a shelf that can be used for something else. And so the thesis, is quite narrow, right? When in pharma, when you start. And you don't know when it says it doesn't work, what are the end factors that can make that data actually be reusable? And so
that's where I think your value is like, what about all the stuff that doesn't work, right? And what's sitting on the shelf?
Yeah, and we meet a lot of clients that says, look, we actually have a lot of data. There's a lot of research. There are times when you talk about, what the capital is, they're ready to do it. There's also not manpower. I mean, biology is complicated. You may not have all the data and all the experiments to run and all the environments to run all the experiments that you want. But research, takes accretive knowledge. And a lot of our clients have data that they know they want to dig back out and keep developing.
That's great. You can actually be you could be the research tool. Like
that's
going
right.
forward when you compound.
Yeah, and because this data could be in any format, in the past it was very difficult to dig it back out. Mm-hmm. We're people from Google, we're like, I don't care what data format you have. I don't actually care, where they're stored either.
Right.
We can just use the knowledge graph, index it and make it.
We invented search, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and enterprise search is like one of these new, really important. It is an idea that you can search your own, database, your own corpus, from by building your own search engine. And in the past, it was like it feels expensive to do. These days, search is a solved problem. If you have a corpus, you want to search it, you can do it. And life science is a little different, mostly because the technology and the depth of the science makes this data difficult to surface, right? Because it's really its own language. And even as simple as looking at all the doctor's notes, it's not really English. It is English, but it isn't. Mm-hmm. And so you sort of need this knowledge graph-based search to make sense out of this very particular language that speaks deeply to science, and you have to understand the science to make the search make sense. But all that is much more available if you use a knowledge graph approach. And so going back to where people have a corpus of data, you just need to figure out how to, rediscover the value in the data that they have. Like we have customers that would say, we have 10 years of safety records, and it's in random, non-OCR'd, data, or even in paper that is in a vault. And currently, they know there's a gold mine there. They don't know how to mine it. And we are that tool that help you mine all that data so that we can understand it now in this, new ways of, looking at, textual data that is not just the big world of English, but we can, in an exacting way, look at particular diseases, derive understanding and knowledge from it, and help our customers look at it in a much more meaningful way.
Is there a world where, since you're going to be, Greater Vision, you can monetize their research, that they can be compensated for the research that hasn't gone anywhere for them?
So I have been staying away from that. I think for us to be a true infrastructure platform, we need to stay away from generating IP ourselves. We don't want our customers to think that we're competing with them.
Right. Got it.
So we want to be the engine. If we need to be a neutral infrastructure.
Well, no, but if you're going to be the system of record and people can pay you to read somebody else's research, would that person who input that research can be compensated for that, even though they might be unrelated projects?
Yeah, so we do have professional services in a company, but I'm trying to build a software company. Right. And all investors say, Angela, you can't, we're not going to value a professional service company. I get it. Mm-hmm. And so there is professional services, but we need to be very careful because our customers want to know that there's no sort of like conflict of interest, that you have engineers that learned my IP and now you're taking it to another company and using it. So we want to be very careful of that. Because if we aren't doing that, then no customers would trust us. Right. And in this space, in pharma and life science, if you don't have trust of your clients, you can forget it.
What is something about the life science big pharma industry that you've learned that the public doesn't know?
Oh, so many. Where do I start, David?
I mean, because everyone, I think, has a general consensus. It's this big, dark, gloomy, business. It's, the vampires, always looking out for the margin, the dollars. And I just don't know if that's true. And I don't know, you probably would never say that, considering that they're your customers. But, what is just your been experience, and what is something that like the industry doesn't know or the people don't know?
I think the space is super opaque. And so I think that they really value marketing and storytelling. Mm-hmm. And there is almost a layer between the actual science and, how the story is told to the public. Mm-hmm. And like I said earlier, I remember reading, when the pandemic started, I would read media reporting of the vaccines.
Mm-hmm.
And because I've had a few years of just super superficial training in reading scientific journals, that how statistics and how this kind of science is reported in the public is so different from how a clinician or a scientist would talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And it's so easy to spin. And for the public, it's very difficult to follow.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that I don't have the skills. I really, look forward to meeting more people that know how to do the storytelling to make this very complex story of biology and science and have it be understandable by the day-to-day person that just wants to read a 1,000-word article or even a 100-word article and not get misled on, what the significance of whatever it is. But by regulation, there is the disclaimer is almost always longer than what the effect or efficacy of anything is.
Right.
And it's so difficult to understand. I mean, even when you listen to an advertisement, you're not really supposed to, there are all kinds of regulation on how you advertise, therapeutics to the public. And for the public, they hear much more about the side effects.
Right. No, exactly.
And it's so difficult to decipher because of this, regulation-centric, way of approaching and who's opposed to the authority and be able to recommend diagnostic therapeutics to patients. I really wish that there is like a way to make it more accessible. And I think that would be a great breakthrough for the world.
What are your thoughts on all these specialty pharma, medicines that are coming on the market? It seems to be a huge boom in personalized medicines, biologics, infusion therapies.
Yeah, it's the future. And that's where also in terms of development of it, that's where our platform really shines, when you have these generics that is, small molecules that has, these big blockbuster drugs. They act a certain way, but the biologics, precision medicine, they are studied differently, and the data sciences required to develop them tend to be more complex and at bigger scale. And so this is where, as a computer scientist, those are important development. And also because there's so much data in it, the early statistics, it's still maybe too early to tell, but in the last, I can't remember where I read, in the last however many years it has been, these new types of therapeutics, large molecules, are much more successful. The success rate is much higher than the small molecules. I don't have a hunch on why, besides that, they can be more exacting. There's more data to tell. And the experiments is therefore, there's a lot more to study. And maybe that helps shines the light on whether these molecules work. And the science reasoning of it is much more transparent because there's more to study about it. But, that's me as a computer scientist talking. And when I look at it, I'm like, of course, there's more data here. You would. Right. But I'm not a scientist, so, we still have to ask the scientists on whether that is the case. But I think these large molecules, in terms of volume over time, for sure is going to take over compared to the small molecules.
When you're an early stage researcher, research group, research lab that's, doing a drug or, a therapy, can you pivot? If something doesn't work, or is it like, you get the grant or you get the funding and if your thesis doesn't work, it's a wash?
Yeah, I assume that they do that all the time. I don't want to represent scientists, but I imagine that, like I said, I think a lot of assets, go on a shelf and then someone's like, but I can use that for something else.
Okay, so they would do something else with it as opposed to taking that pool of money and switching it.
Yeah, I'm not really in that space, so I don't know how they do it. But you're right that in that world, compared to tech, there's a lot more, a lot of these companies are not that big. Is mostly around an asset, and they do a lot of outsourcing in terms of doing experiments with it. And then, in the different, phase gates, they decide what to do, whether they get on to the next phase and or pivot and or sell it and or, however they do it. And so hypotheses are there are plenty of hypotheses that are waiting to take the next stage. And sometimes they do change, and they're all biology is all related also, right? I mean, one thing affects the other, and so but the discovery of it is very opaque, mostly because we still don't understand a lot about how you and I work as a being.
Last question, unless I decide to ask another one, which happens all the time.
I'm going to count.
Is you went from big company, successful tech executive to early founding team of a very successful company to being the founder themselves. What's been like key learning, what you didn't know back then to now?
So many. You ask these like questions that are so difficult to answer, David. It's a humbling experience to go from a big company to a small company. Because at a big company, I had 1,000 people working for me, and of course I know everything. I work in the top of the world. I run Google search engineering. I mean, what is there that I
You're
don't
the boss
know?
applesauce. Yeah.
Exactly. And it's a very humbling experience that in smaller companies, you have to do more to be successful. You have to be a lot more flexible. You have to be a lot more versatile. Because, in a large company, things are sliced so thin that every task has a person, a team, or a whole organization to take care of it. And the requirement of the job generally is something very deep, and it's not as multifaceted. It's like a single facet of this company that you really need to excel at. Even at, relative, going towards, I was like a general manager of like 1,000 people, right? But you only have to know so much to be successful in those roles. When you go to a smaller company, there are fewer resources, but every company still has all those functions. And when I founded this company, I always tell people you are talking to the business development team, the sales team, the CEO of the company, the founder, shareholder, CFO, and the janitor, all in one person. Because there's not as much differentiation in the job. But that's also the fun of it, right? You learn a lot more, and I have to say, even though it's much more tiring, but the journey and the personal growth is something that I won't give up. It's like so good to be forced to have to learn all these things that I don't know. Like I'm clearly, a lot of people would be able to figure out right away, I'm not a salesperson. But you can't just hope to hire people to do everything. So at the beginning, you just have to do everything. And you have to wear all the hats, and you have to be able to, compartmentalize what you're doing every minute and focus and be super versatile. And so problem solving and it's accelerating. I mean, every day regulation change. And, in COVID, we all had to learn, well, you're the CEO, you're responsible for making these policies. As in what policy, right? And so it's super interesting. I think that on a personal level, it's a great opportunity that actually is a privilege to be able to do it.
Angela, you're amazing.
Oh, thank you, David. You've been so good to talk with, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much. If I ever go to San Francisco, we're going to go get drunk together.
That sounds great.
You're somebody I'd like to drink with or to drink coffee with. Everybody, thank you so much for listening to The Capital Stack. We drop an episode every Tuesday. If you like what you hear, please tell a friend, and we'll see you next week. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you for tuning in to the Capital Stack Podcast. Make sure to share this with someone you know that can benefit from this content. Remember to support this show by rating, reviewing, and subscribing. David Paul is the founder and general partner at DWP Capital. All opinions expressed by David and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of DWP Capital. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon for decisions. David and guests may maintain positions in the securities discussed on this podcast.